Okay, good morning. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. I'm Glenn Hubbard, and it's a thrill for me to be at this event and to moderate this wonderful panel. I'm here in many capacities, but in particular as the faculty director for the Jerome A. Chazen Institute for Global Business here at the Business School. This is our fourth annual forum. We call it a global forum. Today's title is Globalization after the U.S. election. Before we start turning to the event for today, I just want to remind you the usual housekeeping. Turn off your cell phone ringers. We were all doing that up here to be good boys and girls, so you do that too. And please remember that a core value of the university is an exchange of ideas. So we'll have a conversation among ourselves up here for a while. I'll be then turning to you for questions. So be sure to have those as being top of mind. So we'll have a conversation and then take questions. And obviously, we very much hope that you enjoy the event. Just a little bit, if I may, about the Institute and its role in the university. For 33 years now, the Chazen Institute has been a core part of global business education at the business school and at the university. It was the brainchild of Jerry Chazen, who was a 1950 alum of the school, founder of our institute, and one of the creators of the Liz Claiborne Company. Jerry had an active and generous life in many ways, but he was very committed to the idea, as we have as a business school for decades, that business school education has to have a global mindset. When we started this act at the Chazen Institute in the early 1990s, that attitude was a lot less prevalent than it is today. But Jerry, and we hope Columbia, were very much ahead of their time. Now, the Institute is the hub for global activities at the business school, and in many respects for the university as well. An image we have in our mind's eye at the Institute is one of inhaling and exhaling. We view our job as trying to inhale the world to Columbia and exhale Columbia's thought leadership to the world. How do we do this? 3 ways. One, we support and disseminate faculty research. We support PhD students, case studies, all about global business and the economy. We convene, as a second item, forums and events on campus like this one and all over the world to foster intellectual exchange and deepen understanding about globalization. And third, and very important in the lives of our students, we support experiential learning programs globally, where we take groups of students all over the world. As somebody, when I was dean, who shook a lot of hands of alumni around the world, when I would ask them, tell me what your top experiences were at Columbia, a Chazen trip was always among them. Now, speaking of inhaling and exhaling, it's probably a good time to take a deep breath because we're going to talk about the election. Now, we're not going to be prognosticators about R.F. Kennedy Jr. or Trump or Biden, but we are going to try to take a look broadly at what some of the election themes might mean for globalization and for our economy. So we're going to be focusing a lot on our knitting, which is globalization. We have 3 standout experts joining in this conversation this morning. Just a brief introduction. To my immediate left is Minouche Shafik, who I'm proud to say is our 20th president at Columbia. It has been wonderful to have her on campus. She's also a professor in the School of International and Public Affairs. She, for a long period of time, has been a leader as an economist and as a policymaker. She was the president and vice chancellor of the London School of Economics, but before that, deputy governor of the Bank of England, the deputy managing director of the International Monetary Fund, and the youngest ever vice president of the World Bank. Going further to my left is Joe Stiglitz, Joe, of course, won the Nobel Prize in economics, our highest honor in our profession. Joe's path-breaking work in asymmetric information changed generations of scholars' works, including mine. I consider much of my work as being trying to keep up with Joe over many decades. Apropos of this conversation, though, Joe draws on a rich policy background, having been chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Clinton, the chief economist of the World Bank, and of course, active globally in advising policymakers. His book, Globalization and Its Discontent, was an early shot across the bow of some of the themes we're going to be talking about today. And then finally, furthest left from me is Xavier Rolet, who I'm pleased to say is a graduate of Columbia Business School, class of 1984, former CEO of the London Stock Exchange, is active in a number of boards of directors and investment activities. And importantly, to all of us at the school, one of those boards is the board of Columbia Business School. He's also been very active in advising governments as well. So we are well in line. Now today, we have a lot to work with. We have a big presidential election coming, and fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your point of view, attitudes toward openness, toward globalization, indeed toward the international order are likely to figure prominently. I think there's little question that globalization contributed to the populist pressures we are seeing emerging on both the right and the left in the United States and globally. 8 years after their emergence, at least in American politics in 2016, they're very much still there. And trade policy and industrial policy are going to be core elements of what we will be talking about in the economy. If we were here 10 years ago having this conversation, we might look at it through a lens that looks a little more neoliberal and say, what the heck is going on here? But a lot is going on here. You know, economists often remind people that imagine I had a coin and the head side of the coin is growth, which is what we all want. Well, the flip side of a coin that has growth is disruption. There is no model of economic growth that's not disruptive. I think a lot of political elites sidestep that very core issue, and here we are. And so we're going to be talking about that today. So Joe, if I could start with you from a fundamental perspective, is this really just a political conversation over the years, or are there evolutions in economic thinking that you think might be bringing up a rethink of globalization or industrial policy? Is it the model or the message?
Well, I think the model has changed very dramatically. The ideas behind the change in the models have been there for 40 years, 50 years, but the mainstream of economics didn't embrace them. And let me just talk about two or three examples. One, picking up on what Glenn said about innovation, progress, and disruption. Globalization was presented as a big disruptor that would lead to more economic growth. But we didn't take it, the neoliberal model that Glenn referred to assumed that moving resources from one place to another would happen seamlessly, easily. And one of the things that motivated my writing the book on globalization and discontent was that at the World Bank, I'd seen that was not happening. And so the story was you move people from low productivity import substitution to more productive export growth was going to lead everybody to be better off. It was going to increase the size of the pie in developing countries. More often than not, what happened is it led people to go from low productivity import competing industries into zero productivity unemployment. And so you didn't see that economic growth. In the United States, we managed things a little bit better, and this illustrates it. But another part of the problem, we didn't have, say, after NAFTA, we didn't have an increase in unemployment, but that was over in the aggregate. But there were really effects in particular places and downward wage pressure. So globalization did contribute to inequality, and there have been a number of studies, one on NAFTA by one of our colleagues, Professor Washington, and another one looking at China's accession into the integration to the global market, which showed that in those places in the United States where they produced goods that were competitive with China, unemployment was higher, wages were lower, property values were down. So that smooth transition didn't happen. And that was a fundamental idea in neoliberalism. One of our colleagues at business school, Bruce Greenwald, who's sadly retired, he and I wrote a paper about what happens when you have this kind of immobility, cost of mobility, and how it can actually lead to unemployment and increase in inequality. So globalization was sold as if everybody, everywhere, was going to be better off. And if that had been true, it would have supporters everywhere. And what's so remarkable is it was opposed in both the developed and the developing countries. And that was partly because it was so disruptive that there were big losers, and we didn't take into account what help they needed. The idea was that somehow, if the pie was bigger, everybody would share in that pie. It didn't happen. The second thing is related to one of the big policy issues right now in the United States and in the global economy, which is the standard models, neoliberal models that economists have focused on hadn't really incorporated technical change, the endogeneity of technical change, the fact that if you don't produce steel, you can't learn how to become a better steel producer. That if you don't produce chips, you just lose out on that race to produce the best chips. And when the United States sort of opened up the market, we lost manufacturing capacity, including in some critical strategic industries. Well, there had been a theory that had talked about these ideas that you have learning by doing, you have investment in R&D by corporations, but and that free trade could actually increase the disparity between countries and might not even be globally efficient because of the effects it has on innovation globally. Well, so where we are now in the United States today is we say we haven't been able to develop the green technologies, the chip technologies that we need to be competitive. And so we now are beginning with industrial policy.
Yeah, that's where I was hoping you would go, because I hear you on the arguments on globalization, but of course, what's front and center on the policy debate really is industrial policy. You referred to learning by doing as being a reason for it. Make the case for industrial policy for us.
Well, the way to think about it, the question is, are markets on their own efficient? And therefore, is there any role for government in the area of innovation? And I think there's a broad consensus among economists that in the area of basic research, technology, And even going up the scale a little bit in more complex technology, there is a role for government. And the reason is there are lots of externalities. There really aren't the prices that you need that guide innovation. So, for instance, I think that the reason that government does and ought to support basic research is that those ideas, you want to be out there in the open. You want people to take advantage of the knowledge that we produce, and the production of the knowledge requires a very, what I call, an open architecture. We need to talk to each other. And so there's a little bit of a tension. The private production of knowledge requires patents, copyrights. It closes knowledge down. And that may be important in certain areas. I don't want to denigrate the importance of the patent system, intellectual property. But at basic research, it's really a public good that everybody can benefit from. And so what we've done, and I think correctly, in our, you might say, our overall science policy is to say, at the basic level, we want to keep things open. And then at the development of very specific products, we want to encourage innovators to think about them. And the way we encourage them is to get a private return. And there, if you close down a little bit the technology of making a postum or making a particular design of a chair, that's not going to really harm the progress of our economy. But if you were to close down knowledge about atomic, the way atoms behave, that would really have an adverse, or even about ideas in the social sciences and others. So you really want government support for innovation at a very basic level.
But if I could press you on that, Joe, I completely agree with everything you said. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about industrial policy in the US or globally. Connect the dots from those arguments to the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act. How do you see those?
So those relate, the CHIPS Act, well, first of all, the easiest one is the Inflation Reduction Act was an industrial policy to move our economy in a green way, to make an economy that responds to climate change. Here, there's a fundamental market failure. We don't price the consequences of carbon emissions. And in the United States, we haven't even regulated the emissions very well. So there is a view that if we had good pricing of carbon and good regulation, markets by themselves would have an incentive to innovate. And so this is, many people think, is a second best measure, given that we don't have prices.
Yep.
We need industrial policy to push the innovation. That's not going to happen. There's been remarkable innovation, like in the price of renewables has come down enormously in spite of the adequate pricing. But you start thinking, if we could really push this, it would really make a big difference. My own view is that even with that, there are really important spillovers. You're not going to fully be able to internalize the benefits of moving towards a green economy. So even if we had a price, it wouldn't be an adequate price. Even if we had a regulatory system, it wouldn't be fully adequate. So I would still argue that we probably would need some industrial policy. The CHIPS Act is a really other set of issues. The CHIPS Act focuses on trying to encourage the production of chips. And there, I think there's another issue that we don't price. We don't price national security. We don't price resilience. We don't adequately price the resilience of the supply chain that we saw was so so many problems in the midst of the pandemic, where supply chains broke down all over the place. And in my view, one of the reasons they broke down is that the market didn't price that risk, and people didn't have the incentive. As one example, firms saw the benefit of just-in-time inventory at, exposed problems. It was a good management tool, but it made the supply chain more fragile for the whole economic system, which has obviously implications. We all faced those problems that I think we didn't really think the market have adequately priced. But particularly when there are issues of national security, we think, did firms in Germany adequately price the risk of an interruption to the gas supply from Russia? And I wrote back in one of my books, the sequel to Globalization, Discontents, Making Globalization Work, that I wrote in 2006, I said it was very foolish for Germany to be so dependent on Russian gas because, President Bush may have looked into the eyes of Putin and said he's somebody I could trust. But, even if you trust him, politics is complicated, and I would not want to put all my eggs in that basket, and that's what they did. So to me, this is a reflection of a failure to price risk. And again, a need from a national point of view, we have to have a chips production. And that's what the CHIPS Act is doing.
Yeah, and I want to come back to the election theme, but I want to first bring you into this conversation, Minouche, partly because of your long service in multilateral institutions. What do you think lies ahead for policies toward trade and industrial rebirth? And I guess a question would be, how do we maintain global integration if each country has sort of country by country industrial policy of the sort that Joe outlined?
Yeah, I think we're still living the very long tail of the financial crisis in 2008 and the politics that resulted from that. And the kind of divisions around, erosion of the middle class, the fears around competition and national security. And I think, whatever the outcome of the election, there are some striking similarities between what it means for globalization. I think whatever the outcome of the election, we are going into a more protectionist age. We are going into a period in which more countries are going to use industrial policy. And we are probably going into a period in which debts and deficit will remain high, whether it's a Trump or a Biden victory. Both sides seem, reluctant to kind of tackle those issues. I think for the multilateral system, the tone would be very different. I think Republicans, even though in periods in their history have been great proponents of the multilateral system, I think at the moment there is deep skepticism about multilateralism. I think on the Democratic side, you've got a more traditional view of the advantages of having allies and working collectively through multilaterals. But the biggest constraint is an inability to deliver resources to support the multilateral system. And so unless you can get agreement in Congress to increase the capital of the World Bank to finance to finance climate change, or unless you can get agreement to increase the quotas of the IMF so you have a better global safety net, unless those things happen, we are, I think, going into a period where multilateral institutions will be less powerful and less effective.
But toward that end, if you think about the rules of engagement for trade, like the World Trade Organization, are we going to be able to sustain a rules-based order? It's clear the WTO is unraveling, partly because China versus everybody else. But even among the everybody else, there's a lot of squabbling. Is there a path forward?
I think the WTO is, the head of the WTO, Ngozi, is a dear friend and colleague and former colleague of both of ours. And, I think she's tried to focus on the politically feasible set of agreements, which tend to be in very small areas where you can get agreement. But I think on the big issues, steel, chips, cars, I think we are going to see many, many more disputes, and a dispute resolution mechanism in the WTO, which isn't working,
Well,
which nobody complies with.
Yeah, yeah.
well, exposing that, we've not allowed the appointment of the judges.
Right.
So
exactly.
the court,
There's no court.
court without judges.
Right.
So even if you brought a case,
There's no one to hear it. So it's not a good place. And that, we've seen this massive growth in world trade in recent decades. And for the first time, that growth has slowed. And I think that's a product of exactly what we're talking about.
So Joe Minouche has said that, irrespective of who prevails in the presidential race, we're likely to have these patterns for trade, for industrial policy. Do you agree?
yes, I think the arguments, the mentality which is approached is going to be different. And I think that will have consequences for very big consequences. So I think there's a tendency of Trump to see the world in a zero-sum way. That if somebody is doing better, that means we're doing worse. And I think most economists don't agree with that there are real benefits from trade if we can make the system work. And I think Biden is in that spirit of trade is a good thing if we can make it work. And so where this is really important, I think, is that there are areas where global cooperation is really important, both strategic areas, like I think, the war in Ukraine is really important for us to win, and in areas like climate, where I think we have to cooperate. So it's easier, I think, to get the cooperation if you begin with a mindset that cooperation, multilateralism can have benefits if we can really work at it, versus a zero-sum view of the world where it's all transactional and I have to outsmart you, otherwise you get the benefits from me.
The art of the deal, as it were.
The art of the deal.
Yeah.
And I just think that's where I think economists have kind of failed to make the case on the non-zero-sum view of the world. And you see that perspective spreading, and I think that's really worrying. Worrying for international cooperation, worrying for multilateralism, worrying for trade, worrying for climate change. We have to kind of break that rhetoric a little bit.
Yeah, and I do want to come back to that point.
That goes back to Ricardo,
yes, exactly.
and Adam Smith. I mean, these are really old ideas.
So I'm glad you like classical liberals, even if you don't like neoliberals. That's very encouraging to me to hear. So Xavier, I want to bring you in this conversation as a business leader. First of all, help us figure out how markets are going to react to a Biden win or a Trump win. I mean, people may remember that there was a lot of forecasts that a Trump win would tank the stock market. Market did go down, I think, for a day or so. There are people in the room more knowledgeable than I, but then went up a lot. So we all have to be a little bit humble here. But how do you see markets reacting to either of these candidates?
Well, I can only offer you the humble view of a practitioner, particularly in the presence of three eminent economists. We've got to be careful when I talk about David Ricardo or the appellate court at the WTO. I do think all the things that we've heard are extremely impactful of business strategy today. We don't have a global carbon trading system. That's not the fault of business. It's just because governments can't agree to have national budgets that could be enforced by treaties. And we've seen at COP28 yet again, it was the EU, particularly Germany, that blocked that because they have an energy policy that can't really be reconciled with a binding global carbon trading system. But to answer Glenn's question, if you're a business manager today, if you're responsible or board or responsible for an entity, you've got to have a view on whether that carbon market's going to exist. Today, a ton of carbon trades between $1 and $600. We know what equilibrium should be to price CO2es properly to get to a theoretical net zero target by 2050, and we're nowhere close to that. So how are you going to invest? And there's a clear binary outcome in terms of these elections. If Trump wins versus Biden wins. We've talked about inflation and essentially working backwards from or working away from the global supply chain. Reid cut China off the supply chain for a range of reasons. I don't see how we're going to achieve long-lasting reductions in core inflation if every nation, if every trading group, the US, the EU, the UK, and elsewhere, try to rebuild everything, locally. We're going to move away by necessity from the efficiencies of a global trading environment. So all these issues, I think, will be impacted. One of the major differences between the two candidates that, I'm not talking about Bobby Kennedy Jr., are likely to win, but Glenn mentioned the name, so I thought it was fair to give him some visibility, is clearly the approach to China already shows some differences. And if you think of a stock market reaction, in the case of a Biden win, there'll be an assessment of what his fiscal policies will be, what his trade policies will be. There's already a softening of the relationship with China, of course, which he linked to a difficult position in Ukraine. A Trump administration probably would handle Ukraine very differently and likely would take, in the short term, a much tougher position against China. I think that's a fairly logical deduction based on their current pronouncements. In that case, in terms of stock market, if you're an investor, looking at trade policies, looking at your Chinese investment, looking at manufacturing, if you look at the 10 years preceding COVID, has seen massive disinvestment, massive exports of jobs. According to many institutes, 5 to 6 million jobs have left US shores, have gone to Mexico, have gone to China. We've seen buybacks. In fact, there's been more buybacks in the 10 years preceding COVID than equity issuance, 4 trillions versus 6 trillions. The investments have gone into the technology sector, but they've not gone so much into manufacturing. So if we apply a capital market lens to that, it's clear that fiscal policy, it's clear that regulatory policies have had an impact. And in terms of the stock market reaction, I think likely will be a knee-jerk reaction. I think a Trump win would probably create expectation of the more supportive fiscal policies, less regulation. So you could see a little bit of an initial upswing. When one looks at trade, for example, that is likely to create some issues for a number of businesses. When you look at investments, that is also likely to see a bifurcation of investment away from companies looking at hedging their carbon exposure, for example, or taking more pro-environmental policies. And I think the impact, again, from a macro policy, I don't see a huge delta between the two. Where I do see an impact on the stock market will be geopolitics, because their views are very, very different. And in one case, the impact on China will be, in my opinion, far more significant.
Let me follow up with you on that, Xavier. You're talking about the way business people or financial market participants might absorb these things. Now I want you to imagine pushing back. So are there things business leaders should be saying about domestic political problems, geopolitical issues? For example, a group of prominent business people joined a dinner with Xi Jinping. Is that the sort of thing that we should be doing? What should business leaders be doing as opposed to just absorbing these problems?
In my humble opinion, the one area where business does have a past responsibility and could put forward some proposals that could be politically impactful is in relation to business approach to immigration. And I'm not talking about immigration legislation per se, but business has a responsibility over, particularly manufacturing business over the last 20 years, for offshoring a lot of jobs. The use of low rate policies, deductibility of debt to fund buybacks, increase in earnings in traditional manufacturing businesses. A lot of that has gone into buybacks, and the vesting a long-term incentive plan has been great for management, it's been great for shareholders, hasn't always been good for labor. So what could business do today, away from the partisan debate, to put forward immigration policies that could help bridge that gap? And in my view, if you looked at sector by sector, particularly in manufacturing, and also by geographies, by state, there are some mismatches between the availability of labor and the economic growth opportunities. So if business, there are chambers of commerce, there are many professional organizations that could map where investment could be directed with supportive immigration policy, qualitative, as well as, of course, unskilled labor, that could derive direct benefits in terms of organic GDP growth by state and by sectors, and then propose the design of immigration policies that could be both dynamic, that could be flexible, but that could have direct benefit for economic growth, because today we're operating in very tight labor markets in the United States, and not having a positive pro-growth immigration policies for business also handicaps the growth opportunities of the US economy. So that's an area where I would say business in aggregate, particularly in manufacturing economy, could make progressive and constructive proposals.
Now that's very useful. I want to follow up on that and then turn to Joe and Minouche on exactly that point, because unfortunately there's two immigration discussions happening at the same time with the public. One is what, for lack of a better term, I would almost call a national security discussion. It's about borders. Another is a discussion about talent, which is, I think, what you were talking about. So from a business perspective, what sorts of talent proposals should business leaders be advocating, and how can business leaders help policymakers disentangle this borders issue, which is salient, from a talent issue? Xavier, you first.
Well, I think if you were to look at state by state, sector by sector, look at ag, look at hospitality, look at technology, look at manufacturing, and state by state and sector by sector, and identify the gaps, and then propose a plan where selective immigration, by the way, touching unskilled as well as skilled labor, could be allowed, and this can be managed dynamically. It need not be static for decades, with specific commitment by business sectors to invest as a result. So there could be plant and equipment, there could be factories, there could be training, with a model essentially offering an economic growth benefits in terms of tax income, payroll benefits, job creation. Again, state by state and sector by sector, you could make a constructive policy. Australia, for example, has implemented a very selective immigration a system that has been quite successful for them. Okay. The flip side is it has drained a number of neighboring countries from skilled labor. But if you look at it from a US perspective, in an environment where there are still labor shortages today, I think mapping the potential economic benefits to the country at large and to individual states can be one way that business could make a positive contribution to that debate.
Okay, Minouche.
I just want to make 2 points. One, a plug for universities, because probably the best immigration policy is to use universities to screen for talent. Letting universities choose talented students and then have those talented students stay on in the US to become productive citizens is a lot smarter immigration policy than anything the government could organize itself. And so I think that's a really important thing that's worked in the past and should be part of any talent strategy going forward. And the second point I'd make on immigration is that, one of the advantages that the US has relative to many of its peers is it is not experiencing massive demographic decline. And if you look at Europe, if you look at large parts of Asia, China, Japan, much of its neighbors, those are countries that are really going through massive demographic decline with massive consequences for fiscal policy, pensions, and their future competitiveness. And so we do need to think about the important role that immigration plays in terms of maintaining demographic dynamism and the benefits for the economy from all of that.
No, those are very big points. Half of the students, roughly, at Columbia Business School are not Americans. And I've always thought our goal ought to be that they would all work here, not because we're being nice people, but because we're being selfish people. We want the smartest and best people around. And so I agree with you. Universities have a lot to do. I sometimes jokingly said, maybe not the lawyers. No offense to the lawyers. But,
We have enough of those.
but for the scientists and business people, I'm all there. And on demography as well, globally, demographic challenges are there. And so one way we can prevail as an economy is to continue to be attractive. And I think we are attractive.
Right.
The question, will we design policies? Minouche, you'd mentioned earlier about the need for economists to help people understand non-zero sum. For immigration, Xavier gave a business perspective. How could we make that sale to politicians, that there's a gain here? It's not an us and them.
It's really tough. Almost every serious piece of economic work on immigration has shown that it's net positive for the country. And so the economics is pretty clear. It's the politics that's difficult, like in so many of these areas. And one of the things I think is important to look at is that it's not so much the level of immigration that upsets people, it's the pace. And if there's a sense that it's uncontrolled and unplanned. And so if it's orderly and the pace is at a pace that people can absorb, that tends to be more politically acceptable. So I do think there are a set of issues and policy issues that can help address the immigration politics such that we can get some of the economic benefits.
Joe, immigration.
Well, first, let me say, if we think we have a labor shortage, and there's a lot of evidence of that, we ought to think first, at least, of how we can use the current labor force we have in the United States.
Yes.
And one of the things that is very evident compared to a lot of other countries, we don't provide child care facilities, we don't provide family leave policies, sick leave. So we make it more difficult, particularly for women, to participate in the labor force. So we've been very good in finally opening up our universities and educating women, but we've not been as good in using the talent that we've created, that we've helped enhance. So one part of this ought to be this sort of, a broader social agenda that is directed at asking the question, how do we use our labor more productively? And that includes issues of going back to the business community. How do we create, in some cases, more flexible labor markets where adapting to changing lifestyles? And the pandemic was pretty good in that. It opened up the door to remote working in a way that it hadn't been before. But we ought to use that particular moment now to really take advantage of that and really expand our domestic labor force. The second observation I make is that is really seconds what Glenn and Minouche have said. It is really remarkable. We attract the best people around the world to our universities, and we give them a great education, and then we tell them they have to leave. I mean, it's really crazy if you think about it. We give them 1 year or 2 years or 3 years. We've extended a little bit, but the view of some other countries is you come here and get educated, and we want you to stay here. And I think we really ought to be changing our immigration policy, which would strengthen our universities. We get even more talent. So many of our students say one of the reasons they've come here is for the potential of staying here. And if we opened that door, that would really be good. The third thing I do want to say is the universities are under attack by a whole variety of people. And to me, I find that so difficult to grasp because I think the universities have been the strength of the United States. Not only do we have, if you ask what sector are we really number one unambiguously, it is really our universities. But they are if you look at high tech, why is high tech here? Well, high tech is the United States partly because of our universities and the talent that we've created. And that's true in the biosector, all the pharmaceuticals, it's because of our universities. And there have been proposals, talk about, what difference would an election make? Trump asked for a cut of 30% in science budgets. That would be devastating. So that's one of the areas where it would make a very big difference. And if we want to think about what is going to sustain the U.S. leadership, I think, those investments in science and universities and social sciences are all
Yay, the NSF economics program.
are all important.
Xavier, I know you have a strong point of view on this as well from a business perspective.
Yes, very much so. And I think Joe's point, and previously made by Minouche, is really important. I've worked and been responsible for businesses in over 60 countries and still am in a number of countries. Let me put it in an even simpler way. The American university system is the envy of the world. And I don't say this to satisfy some sort of nationalistic notion. It is truth. It is dedicated to scientific exploration, which actually questions itself first, if it's really truly scientific, but needs the freedom to explore. And it's true, as Joe said, that there is at the moment a political movement to sort of force universities to stoop down to a level of political partisanship that is not helpful. Before you take their hammer at institutions like this one or the other great universities of the world that are on these shores, you want to really be careful and think of whether you're not destroying a significant competitive advantage. And I think particularly it's married to another area where the United States not only has an advantage, but is actually, under any sort of norm or economic benchmark, the only country of the world that has such an advantage. It's the power of its equity markets to scale up innovation to a global scale. There is no other country in the world, anywhere, that has the depth, sophistication, and ability to scale up innovation. You hear of startup economies everywhere. Many countries around the world have good science, lots of entrepreneurs, but when they want to scale up their businesses to the, not just a few billions and the unicorns, to the multiple 100 billion, to the $1 trillion global relevance, they all come here. And so nurturing and maintaining the advantage, the competitive advantage of those equity markets in combination with the advantage given by these great universities, to me, that's the secret sauce. And that does not, again, take my word for it, I've been in that business and still am in some respects. Many countries in the world are trying to work towards getting there. Well, for a range of regulatory, fiscal reasons, and ultimately, in my humble opinion, desire by policymakers to control the distribution of capital to the corporate sector, which is the killer of economic growth, the killer of innovation scaling up. We've seen what happened to China, which is an area that I'm still involved in, part of the world. If we stay away from that, and the outcome of the elections, I think, is unlikely to move as regards equity markets significantly in an adverse direction. But on the side of education, we could see a bifurcation. And I would see the combination of these two is really the secret sauce in my view.
Minouche on universities?
I agree with Xavier. I mean, I think, where does economic progress come from? It comes from productivity and innovation. That's how we, move the frontier. And it is that combination of universities and very effective capital markets that have driven U.S. economic growth since the beginning.
New York City.
New York City is a really good example of that. And so So I quite agree. I mean, you undermine these things at your peril.
Yeah, a few things I would add to this. I think this is a very important discussion. American universities are also quite different in the sense that the relationship between the practical world and the university is porous. You know, all of you have mentioned ways in which technology or innovation happen. It's because science doesn't just exist in the university. The interaction with business, with government is there. I think that's quite powerful. I know some are critical of that. To me, that's a big plus. I would say, though, as a devil's advocate, that by just focusing on universities, we may be missing part of the political discourse. I'll give two examples. One might be the way to assuage some of the political concern would be to put applied research centers around the country. We probably should be giving basic research money to the very best universities. We could put applied research centers around the country, much as we once did land-grant colleges. The other is, you know, when we're talking about skills and immigration and globalization, community colleges are actually the front line of all this, not Columbia.
Yeah.
And so we need to think about those too. So I would urge all of us, when we think about universities, not to forget those brethren too. Joe, I wanted to pull a tab. You mentioned, you were starting to refer to some public bads, like climate change. I would add pandemics to that. And to all three of you, is this a way to begin? So if you think about how the World Trade Organization came to be, it started through the whole gap period, moving from areas of agreement, you know, and layering as we went. Could we start cooperation with public bads? Is there a way to focus on pandemics, climate change, and then build on that? Or is that just a fool's errand? I don't know, Minouche.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, yes, that makes so much sense. In practice, it's been very hard to disentangle those issues where cooperation is absolutely necessary and essential, like climate change or pandemics, from the wider geopolitics. I think we need to keep trying. I think, you know, I don't know, Joe, if you want to add anything, but you know, we've had baby steps, and I think there are some political differences between the political parties about how they would approach particularly climate change. I think pandemics, you know, I despair, I have to say, at our failure to learn lessons from the last pandemic and our inability to produce, you know, proposals out there for what are peanuts in global terms. $10 billion to set up a pandemic response unit internationally that could be available to monitor global pandemics and try and respond preemptively. You know, and given that we lost, I don't know, $3 trillion or something in the last pandemic in terms of global wealth, the fact that we can't come up with 10 billion collectively, globally, to respond to that is just such a failure of policy and shows such short-sightedness. So I'm afraid I'm very pessimistic at the moment on pandemics. But Joe, you may be
Joe,
a
are
bit
you more optimistic
on-
or?
Where I will agree is it's complex. So let me talk both about climate change and the pandemics and a little bit about you know, the view that the United States, the Biden administration has, is that we can be very aggressive on trade policy with China, but we can cooperate in areas like climate change. Is that they believe a theory of that you can fight in one arena and play together well in another.
But do the Chinese believe that theory?
What?
Do the Chinese believe that approach?
No.
No, that's
They've been very explicit that they don't. But from a pragmatic point of view, China is aware that climate change is having a devastating effect on them. So in the arena of climate change, I think that while China philosophically doesn't agree that you can bifurcate, their interest coincides with our interest of doing something about climate change. So I think we may be able to get cooperation there. But in climate change, the problem is with the emerging markets and developing countries, which are the source of most of the pollution outside. Today Europe is curtailing, United States is even curtailing its emissions, but the developing countries and emerging markets are growing, and they say, you created the problem by all of your pollution. Why should we have our hands tied now? And there is real anger, to go back to the theme we talked about earlier, industrial policy. They say, U.S. told us for 40 years not to have industrial policy. It really hampered our economic growth. We didn't like it, but we had no choice, because every time we did it, you hammered us. And now, after 40 years of doing this, you've changed your tune and you're doing industrial policy. Europe's response is, we don't really like what you're doing, even though we've done it all along. But rather than take you to the WTO court, which has been dismembered, we're going to try to compete with you by having our own industrial policy. Not quite as effective, because I don't know if you know, the IRA now is estimated to be over $1 trillion, and they don't have the flexibility of spending that much money that quickly. So from the point of view of the developing countries and emerging markets, their view is the advanced countries are going ahead, industrial policies leaving us behind. U.S. rhetoric about getting more green jobs, they're saying, well, you're taking away all those jobs from us. And that has really hampered cooperation with the developing countries and emerging markets, which is absolutely necessary if we're going to address climate change. Now, switching to the pandemics, I agree. It is phenomenal that we can't get more agreement on the pandemics, because climate change is something out there. We're experiencing it. It's being brought home, but most of the bad climate change is going to be 10, 20 years from now. We've just been through a pandemic, and we've just lost huge amounts of money, as Minouche said. It should be in our face. We should be able, since it's in our face so much, to do something about it. But, and the cost of doing something about it is trivial compared to the cost of not doing something about it. Science was very clear. We are likely to have another pandemic. We ought to begin to think about it. One of the tragic things in the pandemic was vaccine apartheid, that we in the United States and the advanced countries had as many vaccines as we wanted. And if you were in developing countries, you couldn't get anything. And they went to the WTO, and this is in part, and said, can we have a waiver on intellectual property? You had already agreed on the principle of compulsory licenses. So the issue with the waiver was not a change in the legal framework. It was just saying, we don't want 3 years or 4 years of litigation while we're dying or being hospitalized. We want an immediate waiver. Yes, we'll pay fees, license fees, royalties. We just want to be able to produce those. And Germany, UK, Switzerland said no, and the U.S. couldn't push them. And the U.S. refused to share intellectual property related to therapeutics. So the drugs that were helping people once they got COVID-19. So this, in turn, has gotten a lot of resentment to the global trading rules-based system. The rules have been violated by the U.S., and yet they were forced to obey the rules when they were dying. The whole system, obviously, makes it difficult to get that cooperation. And as we discuss a new pandemic treaty, we were not able to get the cooperation of dealing with this sharing of intellectual property in the event of a pandemic. So, I worry about this difficulty even on these critical bags.
Xavier, any perspective? Or?
Yes. First of all, it's difficult to be on the panel with Joe because he's always going to be ahead of you in all the key areas. And the pandemic is one where I was involved, Nigeria. The United States hoarded 3 billion vaccines, and Europe hoarded 3 billion vaccines. And you couldn't get any vaccines in Latin America, in Africa, and many parts of Southeast Asia. We had the money, we had local manufacturers, pharmaceutical company. We called everybody, the Americans, the Europeans, even called the RDIF. We just couldn't get anything at all. And I think that highlights the difference between, this is where business education can make a contribution. Politics, as Lenin once wrote, the only thing politicians care about is seizing and retaining power. If that means war, if that means, they're prepared to do anything for that. And that's the nature of political power. In business, you operate with counterparties that can be your investors, that can be your competitors, that can be your customers, and that can be your suppliers. So by definition, you have a frame of mind which is a lot more fluid. And I do think that, first of all, I think I'm prepared to President Shafik's point to take that lane to go down the fool's errand. Because I think what we're missing today, and we saw that with the WHO has no power, we're seeing that today in an environment where, when we talk about peace and security, there's the prospect potentially of nuclear exchanges in Europe. Maybe it's possible, maybe not, but it's being discussed in ways that it hadn't been for 20 years. We're facing immediate threats. And unless we have, whether it's pandemic, whether it's peace and security, whether it's climate change, the cost, these are estimates, they're models. The cost of getting to net zero by 2050 is $9.5 trillion a year. Some of it is front-loaded. By the way, net zero keeps us where we are today. It doesn't solve the issue. It doesn't address the stock, doesn't address the imbalance between the pollution that happened since 1850 in Western civilizations versus where the flows are today. These are incredibly complex areas, and we don't have, one of the things, if you look at the EULA-based En-ROADS model, which is available on the internet, look at one of the factors that can be the most effective in helping us get down to, we won't get to 1.5, but maybe 1.7 degrees Celsius, and it's having an effective global carbon framework. And we don't have that today. So getting those governance in those areas on the global level is really the only way, I think, we're going to get there, if we get there. And the elections in the United States are the seminal event this year. But I'll take the fool's errand road in saying, and you can quote me or not quote me, I do think that humanity has a tendency to kind of peer down the ditch of collapse or disaster, and sometimes we even jump into it with 2 feet, as we did in Europe the last century, that cost the lives of 100 million people. This time around, it's not 100 million people, it's the whole of humanity. The planet will survive. And I suspect that at some point, as we peer down that abyss more than a ditch, the necessity in some areas, it's not across the board. Mm-hmm. And we talked about healthcare, food is another one, peace and security, and clearly climate change. We're going to have to empower some global institutions to bring about some agreements, and I think that will happen. Because if it doesn't, well, you can draw your own conclusions. But I'm prepared to say that this might actually happen sooner than we think. Even in the Middle East today, which looks like an intractable, unsolvable issue of bitterness and violence, where the two sides will never come to a deal. My observation is underneath that horrible situation, there are some very powerful economic interests in the Middle East that actually had been highlighted by the Abraham Accords towards moving the model there towards economic growth. You have areas of enormous capital, like Saudi Arabia, for example, areas of technological innovation, like Israel. The two are a fit. Now imagine the Middle East today focusing on scaling up innovation and bringing economic growth imagine the contribution to global stability that could bring. I know it's not in the cards today, but I think it's perhaps closer than we think.
I want to ask one, oh, I'm sorry, Minouche.
Well, no, I just, in terms of Xavier's hopefulness about the international system being able to respond to our current crises, I always remember when the G20 was created and everybody was hopeful that the G20 would be a force for global governance and international cooperation. And after many years of working with the G20, I think I concluded that the G20 is like a tea bag. It only works when the water's boiling.
That's a quote I will steal. So I want to ask you all one last, hopefully fairly brief questions. I want to open it up to the audience. One issue, whoever becomes president, has to do with generative artificial intelligence. So in econ speak, it's the latest version of what economists would call a general purpose technology, something that's so big, it draws other technologies with it to transform the economy. One thing I think that's a little bit different, perhaps, with generative AI is about speed. So we've been having a discussion about industrial policy, about globalization. The policies we're responding to slow-moving changes in the world economy. What happens when the change is fast? And so from each of you, a perspective for that next president, what are the pluses that he's going to have to deal with? And what are the policy challenges from something like a quickly emerging generative AI? Minouche.
So I do think generative AI will have massive consequences across many, many sectors, and will potentially rapidly increase technological innovation across everything from drug discovery to materials to climate change solutions and so on. So we are potentially entering a period of rapid technological change. But the policy issues, I think, are really around fairness and equity. Every technological revolution, and I think people like Darren Asamoglu at MIT has done some very interesting work on the historical impacts of technological innovations. They often generate huge inequality. Because the people who can benefit from the technology do really, really well, and the people who are left behind don't. And so I think the biggest policy challenge will be around fairness and making sure that these technologies actually benefit everyone. And that includes things like misinformation and how that is managed, as well as the consequences for jobs, for how education is going to work, and for the technological innovations that will massively change almost every sector we know.
Joe?
So I want to put that in the context of some of the things that have been going on for the last 10 years or 20 years, and that is the growth of social media, the search engines, the tech giants, and we haven't yet done a very good job of addressing a whole variety of problems that are posed, social harms, societal polarization, teenage or broader mental health problems, incitement, mis and disinformation, which has political consequences. We haven't figured out how to deal with any of those, and AI is going to put all of that on steroids. And so one of the important issues is going to be creating regulatory frameworks for that. Europe has begun, I think, much better than we have, and they've had a Digital Service Act, a Digital Marketing Act, Privacy Act, AI and Ethics Act. So there is at least a beginning in Europe of a discussion of these issues. I don't think they've gone far enough, but we've not really embraced that kind of an issue. And again, it's one of the things where the election might make a difference in the extent to which that occurs. One of the key regulatory issues is competition. And I think everybody recognizes that these are not competitive firms. Their profits are not, they've been going long enough that their profits should have gotten down to a lower level with the entry, or there's not entry. We all know why: network externalities, the fact that data, they have more data, and data is the critical resource here, and it leads to a kind of monopolization. They've been engaged in a large number of allegedly anti-competitive acts, and Europe has called them on it, and other countries have called them on it. They've used data from legacy news sources without paying them. Countries like Australia have tried to create a framework where they get compensated. But let me emphasize how important that is to our society, because what they've done is taken all the advertising revenues away from the traditional media. Without those revenues, you don't have the fourth estate working as part of our system of checks and balances. And so they've destroyed, they're in the process of destroying the sources of information that they depend on. And so it's not clear it's even a sustainable framework. Well, again, AI exacerbates all of that. And then the final point, just to reinforce what Minouche said, is going to be very disruptive. The extent of the distributive effects are going to depend to some extent on how we handle the competition effects. If the AI becomes very competitive, if we can control the mis and disinformation, then the benefits will become greater and more widely distributed. But if it is another monopoly and we don't control the mis and disinformation, I think the consequences for our society are going to be very problematic.
Xavier.
Well, I've got to be careful what I say here, particularly with the immense respect that I have for Professor Stiglitz. And he's right. All the things are correct in terms of, if you assess them in a fashion of fairness, humanity, long-term progress. But we live today in a technologically digital world. It's based on essentially our atomic understanding of the universe. And this is the past. We are moving today into a quantum world. So think an environment where you can have quantum computers operating in geostationary orbit outside of regulation, where the power of processing is millionfold what a digital, even the supercomputers. For those of you who have an opportunity to visit some of the national labs funded by the US government, where they have quantum computers and Cray computers next to each other, but also where communications can be instant regarding of distance. And we might think this is pie in the sky. The first global geostationary satellite was launched in 2016 in August by the Chinese government. It's called Minouche. And they've already tested on the ground, basically quantum state communication, using some of the entangled photonic particles that they had positioned in that satellite. So the reason I mention this is not to sound technologically advanced, because I don't have that knowledge. I just read the papers. But whatever we think AI is today is nothing compared to what it will be when inevitably in the coming years, this is not a decade away, as sometimes read, quantum computers and quantum communication will seize this. And this points, I think, that focus on the comment, I think, completely appropriate and correct. But this is an area where I think if you can, you do, and if you can't, you regulate, which is what Europe has done. Europe is nowhere in that race. And I fear that it's not even going to be, a fight of the right regulation. It's just simply going to escape European shores, because it's not just in the United States where a lot of progress is being made. It's also state agent in China. And they're not going to regulate it in a way that I think the US won't either, will favor, the proper allocation of resources, paying for advertising, paying for intellectual content. All this is gone. This is when we move from coal to electricity and nuclear power. I fear that the movement going into that and the development of technology, sadly perhaps, is going to bypass that fairness and that regulatory debate. And we're already in it. And I apologize, I don't want to offend anybody, but I think it's already happening. And happening here and in China.
Yeah, so as a small coda on that, we have a colleague at Columbia, New Bradford, in the law school, whose work we support at Chazen, who's been doing marvelous work on this European, Chinese, American regulatory game with new technology. So I commend it to everyone. I want to open it up to the audience. Only 2 requests. Questions in with a question mark. And then, if there's somebody in particular you want to ask it of, just say that. So floor is open. Abby. Apologies if you judge me cynical.
What?
Apologies.
No, I understand that.
Hi, I'm Abby Joseph Cohen, formerly a partner at Goldman Sachs, and now very happily a member faculty at the business school. And I'd like to begin by thanking all of you for such a thoughtful and in many ways comprehensive discussion on these very difficult topics. I'd like to drill down a little bit, please, on the subject of inequality. When we discuss inequality, we're often talking about individuals, people. We sometimes raise the issue of inequality among nations, but I'd like to drill down on inequality between industries and companies. One of the things that we have seen dramatically in the United States over the last 3 decades or so is a huge underinvestment in basic research. The government, its spending, whether it's a percentage of the federal budget or whether it is a percentage of GDP, this area has shrunk dramatically. And so, Professor Stiglitz, your points about how important basic research is because it is broadly disseminated and available, what we see is there's much less investment in basic research. And on the other hand, we have seen a notable increase in applied research, R&D, that's done by companies. It is protected by IP, it's protected by patents, and it's not as widely disseminated. And to make matters worse, it has become heavily concentrated in just 3 industries. So if you go back 3 or 4 decades in the United States, you could see that this spending based upon research and R&D was pretty widespread. And now there are 3 industries that represent, if I recall the data correctly, about 65% of the amount. And it is computer hardware, computer software, and pharmaceuticals. And then if we go to the point that Xavier made, which I thought was critical, is what are the capital markets doing? The capital markets keep rewarding these same 3 industries through higher PEs, through lower cost of debt capital, and so on. And we see a concentration, for example, in the market capitalization in the S&P 500. It's almost as if it's a smaller and smaller concentric circle that has developed. So here's my question. There really is a question, Glenn, and that is, what do we do about this? How can policy be used to make sure that there's more basic research? How can policy be used to make sure that we kind of break these incredible bonds that have given this enormous advantage to just a very small number of industries? And by the way, as my coda, when we take a look at where Gen AI investment is occurring, it is the same 3 industries. Yep. They've got the money to invest in their own product and their own research, and many other industries are being left out in the cold.
Who wants to grab that?
Oh, so do you want that one?
Well, first let me say, solving the basic research problem is, quote, easy if you put aside the politics, which basic research has to be supported by government and private foundations, but basically government. And rather than cutting it back, which is what one of the candidates wants, I think we ought to be increasing it significantly. On the second question, there's no easy answer, but one of the things I would pick up is what Glenn said. In the area of applied research, if we supported that more in universities and research centers around the country, I think we would move, Silicon Valley has created a fantastic sort of ecology of knowledge, but it's very focused on one area. And if we diversified it around the country, we have a more diverse, an example of where that kind of thing, in Akron, in that part of Ohio, they have a long history of dealing with rubber, with polymers, and the state university there has been involved in a polymer research. Those are the kinds of things that we could support around the country. Think about all the different industries, and think about where they're occurring. Let's sort of diversify some of our applied research, and that is a way then of getting. It's a kind of industrial policy, but not organized around companies, but around sectors, and using that lever to help expand that diversification, which I think the point you made was absolutely right.
Okay, great. More questions? Right here, Laurent.
I'm Laurent Ganem. It is said very often that globalization is responsible for disparities in wealth. What do you believe the two presidential candidates are going to do about this, if elected?
Minouche?
Well, I think while both of them have views that lean toward more protectionist and industrial policy strategies for globalization, I think their views on distribution domestically are different. So I guess I think the globalization, like so many economic policies, I think Joe mentioned that, I think it did increase the pie globally. I think there's no doubt that it increased the pie. But our logic as economists is, well, you increase the pie and then you compensate the losers, right? And we just never compensate the losers. We just don't have the mechanisms in place to make sure that those who lose from these big technological innovations are made whole and benefit. And so I guess what I'd say is I think they would have very different policies about compensating the losers and achieving the kind of redistribution that would be necessary.
Can I add one?
Sure. Looks like you each wanted to say something.
Good.
I was going to actually pick up with something that Xavier said.
But I'm in trouble now.
No, which is that there were enormous share buybacks.
Yes.
And that was a result of, the promise of the tax cuts in 2017 was that it would lead to big increase in investment, everybody would benefit from it. Right. It didn't happen, and the data that Xavier gave really shows you it was share buybacks increasing wealth in a way, but not increasing, of a few people at the top, but not increasing the size of the national economic pie. Those tax cuts expire, and they were designed to fit within a budget envelope, so they have a very peculiar structure. They were temporary. There are a lot of, and so I think it's very clear that it's more likely that there'll be more progressive taxation. And that would include the corporate income tax, and let me say the corporate profits tax. And one of the important things to realize is the corporate profits tax is a tax on corporate profits. That is to say, you deduct, especially after 2017, you deduct the cost of labor, but also the cost of capital. And that means it actually doesn't discourage investment. It is a tax on monopoly ranks, on other forms of ranks, but it's not a tax on capital. And so it doesn't discourage capital investment. So I think, especially windfall profits taxes and things like that, there'll be more of that under the under the Biden administration.
Yeah.
Xavier, you had something you wanted to say?
Yes, again, it's very difficult to be on the panel with Joe.
It's difficult for me not to disagree with what he just said, but I want to keep this
Right.
train moving. So
A follow-up answer on Abby's excellent question, and Laurent as well. How do you introduce, you can use competition policy, okay? And that is usually pretty weak around the world, even in Europe. But one of the best ways to diversify wealth creation would be for Europe, in my humble opinion, to get rid of the punitive, it's a confiscatory, regulatory, and fiscal regime that has killed, and I do not exaggerate, I can give you some numbers to back it up, that has killed its equity markets. I've helped a number of entrepreneurs in med tech and other areas set up some businesses in Europe. We got some grants from the Max Planck Foundation, from the French government. Came time to scale it up, US was the only place to be, because there's simply the European capital dedicated to VC early stage and scale up. That European capital was investing in the United States, so the managers were there. So getting rid of the Solvency II provisions that prohibit, through regulatory cost of capital, pension funds and insurance companies that are long-term providers of capital from investing in equities is one first step. The quadruple taxation of every pound or euro of equity income versus the deductibility of debt. When Joe talks about buybacks were financed in the United States by two things. The exports of jobs overseas, which ended up having a positive impact on the bottom line, but also low rates and deductibility of whatever interest you ended up paying. And that was great, because if you were a management team, your EPS were shrinking, you weren't investing in the economy, and your long-term incentive plan was vesting. Shareholders loved it too. Labor essentially paid the price for that. So part of immigration policy is today rebalancing that, acknowledging the damage that was done, but really looking at the manufacturing industry through tax policy, deductibility of interest. You can, rather than industrial policy where you're going to spend trillions that ultimately is going to fuel inflation because it negates the benefits of global trade. You can look at regulatory policies impacting capital markets and fiscal policies to rebalance, create a fair level playing field. And in the US, it's not as bad. In Europe, it's confiscatory. If Europe were to rebalance its fiscal and regulatory regime, you'd see a lot of that capital going to European startups. You'd have real global competition. I think it was the Economist issue of December 9, 2016, that analyzed the 100 most successful startups in the world by capitalization since 1975. 25 were in California, 15 were US ex-California, only one was European, and it wasn't even a tech company. So you want to create that wealth effect. Europe hasn't had any growth in 40 years, so it goes deeper and deeper into debt. You need to have equity markets, and that is within the purview of policymakers. Why they're not doing it? Because they love a corporate capital distribution model that, as is currently the case in the UK and Europe, lies within about 90% in the hands of banks through bank lending, which ultimately are controlled by central banks and policymakers. So that freedom, in my view, of capital markets to make those scale-up decisions, decide which innovation and technology is going to be scaled up, is necessary to positively impact a better distribution of capital. If you focus just on equality but not on freedom, you need both, I think, to create wealth creation mechanisms. And I think, to me, because I think Europe is kind of done, in my humble opinion, today.
Okay, before we
I think China is a country to
General,
watch.
when I hear Solvency II, I know it's getting close for me to take the punch bowl away, but I want to do a really fast lightning round before we let folks go. If we were here 10 years from now, so it's the 14th and not the 4th Chazen Global Forum, and we would be saying what about global integration? Minouche, what would it be looking like?
Oh, God. I think the current path is unsustainable for so many reasons, both economically, climate, politically. So I guess I would say we will have some disruption between now and the next 10 years, which will force us to develop a different model of globalization, which, I think inevitably the logic of the system takes you always to a rules-based order. We can, particularly, this is, I think, an important point, if you're a big country, you can manage in a power-based, non-rules organized system. It's not great, but if you're a big country, you can survive. If you're a small country, you're doomed. And that's why small countries tend to be the ones who are the most concerned about having a rules-based international system. And so I worry a lot for that.
Okay.
But I think something will happen in the next decade, and when we meet here in 10 years' time, we'll be talking about a different international system.
Joe?
Yeah, I think if in my optimistic mood, I think we will be moving towards a very different framework for agreements, which are focused on the minimal set of things that we need to do to get along. So that's where ideas like climate change, pandemics will be. Trade agreements won't be the comprehensive kind of trade agreements that we had, the last one being the Uruguay round. They're going to be very targeted on specific issues. I hope as we move more into a belief in science, for instance, that there can be an agreement on science or sharing. Like CERN has been very successful in Europe and as a multinational research unit. I think maybe we'll see more of that kind of cooperation. So it's not only on the bad, but also on the really positive things going forward that we will be able to get cooperation. And in trade, we'll be really focused on minimal things that we need to agree on. Don't do really bad things, beggar thy neighbor policies.
So 2 votes for cooperation so far. Xavier?
Okay, so I think we need to solve our global governance issues, and there's really one institution, only one that can do that, but it needs very deep reform because today it has zero credibility, it's corrupt and ineffective, and that's the United Nations. I think 10 years from now, the United Nations, in my humble opinion, would be very, very, very different from what it is today. And the second point is I'm personally investing heavily in regenerative agriculture and would encourage you guys to look into that because a lot of money is being made, and I think that may be the future of this planet.
Okay, good. Rarely does somebody invite competition with profit as an economist. I love that. I wanted to close this with some thanks. First to all of you. Apologies for running you a little bit over. And of course, thanks to the Committee on Global Thought and the wonderful team of the Chazen Institute that does so much all the time, but particularly for these events. This forum has been recorded, and so it will be sent to everybody who was registered and attended. So you'll get that, and we all hope you enjoy the networking lunch. It's a chance to talk about some of the things that came up, and hope to see everybody at some future Chazen events and the 5th, if not the 14th, Chazen Global Forum. Thank you. Join me in thanking our panelists.